That's working. Oh.
And then let's get... Hey, look at everyone.
Wow.
Good. So, hey, John.
Hi, Heidi.
Hey.
Hi, Rachel and Mary.
Hey.
Okay, a couple more people are trickling in, so we'll give it just a minute more, just to get people going. Hey, great to see you.
Yeah.
Hey. I like the people, like CD, you're so steady and stable. Or maybe that's just a picture, but... Anyway. Okay. Should we do it?
I guess we should do it. Should we?
Okay. So I'm going to clap, but it's just one clap.
Oh. Can I clap too?
Yeah, one. You can all clap if you want. It'll scare the demons away.
Okay.
1, 2, 3. There they go. So, thank you so much for joining us. We are wanting to do a few talks over the next number of months on some contemporary topics that really weigh heavily in the yoga world and in the world at large, and that are kind of intertwined in the way many things, and actually all things are. They're intertwined with one another and with the idea of practicing or teaching yoga. And the one that we're starting with is the idea of sort of what is this thing called the internet, and how is it impacting our lives as yogis, and how, as people who practice yoga, can we sort of help one another and help our communities in an environment where the internet and where the digital age, not only the internet, but phones and you know, electrical, everything is everywhere. And how do we manage ourselves in that, and what is it? And so that's where we're starting. And one of the sort of side pieces from that has been very interesting in the yoga world and the world at large, the world as we have been dealing with COVID for this last year, is what has happened with the idea of cults and conspiracies. And we're not going to talk about that tonight. We'll talk about it another time, but it's integrally interrelated to this whole idea of the digital age. And thinking about this digital age, there's an image that kind of came to us of the digital age being somewhat like an exoskeleton for our culture, for our communities, and in a sense for ourselves as individuals, so that it's this skeletal construction that seems to be forming, in a sense, as a protection, but also more so in a sense as a way that can be an impingement to growth, so that it has this strange sort of paradox, which we're used to in yoga, of something that contains us, but that also may restrict us. And so as we work with discernment, as we work with the idea of communication and what the digital age represents, it's good to keep in mind this image, I think, of it as this living, vibrant creature that is the world at large, or ourselves, inside this structure. And when you think of it in that way, it also has, in a sense, a parallel to our own experience in the world with chittavrittis, where they form this sort of external reality for something that is us, that is very tender, that is very viable and moving and impressive in a way. But when our chittavrittis get sort of stuck in a sense, like a web around us or an exoskeleton around us, it can be quite restraining and quite defeating.
Like a scaffolding around
Yeah.
everything.
And
or
when,
a cell wall.
yeah,
Or-
yeah, for a cell. And then what we see having happened worldwide is that this idea of this exoskeleton has really caused some problems because, and in a way, it again is like what happens with our chittavrittis, but it's where some of the individuals who interface with this exoskeleton use it in ways or get attached to it in ways that become dysfunctional or become actually harmful to others. So taking a step back, if you look at it, I mean, the idea of sort of interfacing, I think it was Tesla way back at the beginning of the 1900s came up with this idea of sort of wireless connection throughout the world. And then there were people in the 1930s and 40s who carried on with that idea and were thinking, wow, this would be a wonderful idea to pull data together, almost like libraries and catalog things. And then the idea brewed a little longer, and in around the 60s, and this is when I was going to college, when you were going to college, I think about it as this funny story where you would go to a class at university, or you'd go to register for a class, and you had to have these big computer cards because there were buildings the size, of some of the huge buildings in New York City that contained all the large computers on campus. And the schedule for everyone was computerized at that point, which was revolutionary. But you had to have these big stack of cards that represented all of the courses that you were taking. And you had to stand in line sometimes for 2 or 3 hours and exchange your card with an actual human who would then type it into the computer to drop or to add a course. And so on one level, I look back at that and see that as this archaic system of computerization. But on another level, what it allowed us to do is, you're standing in line for 2 hours and you might think, well, actually this course is more interesting than I'm giving it credit for. Maybe I don't need to drop it. Rather than in these days, because of the speed of things, our tendency is to not be able to allow ourselves the necessary time to discern sometimes, to consider what really is the best course of action that we might take. And once computers got to that level, then the idea sort of blossomed into the idea of sort of communicating between computers. And I read this story of the very first sort of, it's called packing, I forget what it's called. It's called something where you take information packaging or something and you pass it between 2 computers. This was this revolutionary idea. And the Defense Department in the United States funded this great project and got a huge computer the size of a small house at UCLA and another one in Sanford. So it was like some distance between them. and they were going to communicate, and they wanted to communicate the word login. And so it was this big event, and they, tried to communicate it, and it went through like 80%, rather than the entire word login went between these two huge computers. And I'm telling you all of this because it's kind of interesting to think of this as being only 50 years ago. And the amount of change that has happened in this 50-year period. And we think back to this last year, a year ago, March, April, where the pandemic was just beginning, and here we are a year later, and we realize how quickly 50 years passes and how things change, but they change very, very slowly. And there's the idea in evolutionary anthropology and in the book Homo Deus, I think I read about it, of how one of the problems with modern culture is that we have evolved so quickly technologically that we really, as a species, have not evolved quickly enough to be up to speed with the evolutionary advances technologically that we've made. This being an example of one. And what that means is, typically when there's evolution in a species, it takes a long time, and the species, adjusts and then becomes graceful, and the good parts of that species blossom. But when it's a burst like this, sometimes what comes about are things that are ill-conceived, that are non-skillful, that might even emphasize the individual separateness, the individual negative aspects of being human, rather than the more genuine and wonderful aspects of being human, because there just hasn't been time to catch up. It's like giving a teeny little kid a hammer. They have a hammer, they walk around and hammer every glass table and every window because those are the things that seem to respond best. And in a sense, that's where we are with this digital age. And yet it's also this amazing opportunity, like we're able to communicate here, now, like we're able to learn all kinds of information. And so what Richard and I thought might be helpful for those of us who study yoga is to look at how do we take what we do normally and look at this kind of big problem of an exoskeleton that is maybe containing some of the problematic things within our cultures in a way that might not be so healthy, but also has a good silver lining to it. How can we take what we already do and really allow ourselves and sort of maybe through that help others to use this age of digital everything to benefit people rather than to take advantage of people. Because what happens often is things like greed or dishonesty or separatism start to, and distrust and lack of discernment start to come forth because we don't have that time, like I did, standing in line waiting to drop my course to reflect on things because it's too fast. I didn't respond to your text quickly enough. Forget it.
Yeah. And a lot of the current technology makes you totally interested in how you look.
Yeah.
Either, one is literally, how's that selfie going? And so you're just in love with that image on the screen. But then how you look in terms of information, and that's that absorption is natural for, it's just part of the ego mechanism. But it gets emphasized. That's one of the first things that is
And
out
then,
of control, and it can really cause, more problems than it cures.
and then the fallout, the residue from it, and the reason that we know it's a little bit of a problem is the residue often is stress, fatigue, burnout, lack of ability to communicate clearly. And so when those parts of the residue start to bubble up, then it's our opportunity to pause and say, wait a minute, that's actually just an aberration of the situation and the context. What can I do about that to shift that? And so looking at this, paralleling it with chittavrittis, with the classical way of considering discernment, is a way to start. Sort of teasing this puzzle of this exoskeleton idea apart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what is a vritti?
I don't know, let me look it up.
Because it means a twisting, it really is like it sounds. Vrit, 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 vrit. It wouldn't be my favorite mantra to chant. And it's basically a twisting where you get confused with the name and the form of something. And by the name, it could be it doesn't have to be a spoken name, it could be any image or indicator or electronic blip that represents something else, which is, and then the form is the thing that you're trying to represent. And of course, you can represent representations like in Alice in Wonderland. What's the name of your name? And then you can just make chains and chains like that, which certain people have discovered that.
Yeah, and that's like going off down a rabbit hole.
Literally.
Yeah, when you're researching something online.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in the nice thing in the yoga tradition, the term rupa actually is referring to form that's perhaps more basic. And this is what the technological scaffolding isn't in touch with, is like our embodiment in this world. So it's difficult to, so when you're dealing with chittavrittis, in yoga of course is the suspension of them in the sense of like overwhelming awe or stunning as the chittavrittis allow you then, by suspending them, then you start to experience the continuous unfolding, like the unfolding of a tree or a flower or something reveals what the sky is. You have no idea what sky is until you get this beautiful Shakti unfolding. And that requires that the vrittis themselves are part of what's unfolding at certain times. So there's certain times and things that are appropriate. But the whole thing in the Yoga Sutra is that you find that which is essential first. This is why a beautiful thing about the different approaches to yoga is that you first become embodied. In other words, you start to really feel your body through your feet, through the pelvic floor, through the middle path, hopefully soon through the heart you start to feel. And then the exploration begins.
And so we were talking earlier about the difference, though, between how we construct these sort of what could be looked at as an individual exoskeleton with our chittavrittis or the movements of mind. But there's a huge difference between what we do as an individual and what the technological age has landed us in. And this is an interesting difference with the sort of tenderness of who we are inside of ourselves as represented through the chittavrittis. You were talking about, the different kinds of them and being able to
And so what happens is we initially start to say, the vrittis are like electronic internet or something. And indeed, that's a very vritti place. And then we think, well, I can live without it. We lived for millions or billions of years, as we've done pretty well. So let's just get rid of them. And that's the initial thing, not knowing or not recognizing that the idea of the vrittis is also a vritti, that terrible paradox. And so we judge the internet or social media or all of these things as bad, and that in itself is something that we don't then see. And so the whole teaching in traditional yoga is that there are good vrittis and bad vrittis, and then kind of neutral vrittis. So most vrittis are neutral.
Yeah.
And so the good vrittis are those that within a specific and temporary context actually help you to discover what is of real importance, which is all beings in your heart. And so vrittis can actually, in fact, you have to use the vrittis, which can manifest in the form of mantra, or they can manifest in the form of some good talking or good teaching or good understanding. And the vrittis also, say if you buy books on the different dharmas, those are all technically vrittis. But in a temporal sense, they can go, these are good vrittis, and we're going to encourage them. Then a bad vritti, of course, is something that makes you confused, and it tends to make you identify with all those things that you're not. And so you'll see things that are impermanent, and you'll think they're permanent. Then the suffering goes on and on and on. And so the traditional thing is to then, how do we get initially into the good vrittis by, in a sense, finding out that which really counts. And so, for example, in yoga, they encourage you to, even before you do yamas and niyamas, different schools have different things, but they want you to feel the present moment. They want you to get into, so in asana, you become grounded, and then you become open, or sukha, which is usually translated as happy, but it means a good whole. So you have a good whole, or a good pathway in your heart up through the crown. And then you're sthira, meaning that you're stable, and you're grounded in reality, but reality not in the sense of, reality in the sense of that which we share. And so, like the planet Earth, we tend to share. And so you become sthira and sukha, and then the mind naturally gives up, once it starts to feel, we've all done this, even when you're doing the internet, if you sit straight, it doesn't pull you in quite the same way, because the movement of your vrittis doesn't close your heart and make you identify with all of the endless storylines of desire. But if you can, and I'm struggling with this, when I start to do, and if I'm sitting there, And then it only takes about 10 seconds usually, and like I'm sucked into the computer itself. And,
Yeah.
it's very sad. So if I can get this good posture, then there's this sense of satisfaction, which is intrinsic rather than dependent on, and so there's this natural discrimination or between that which is of any essence, which we are hesitant to name, because when you name it, then you've got to be able to continue to see that that name that you named it isn't what you're naming, if that makes any sense. But then the mind naturally, they say, goes and is absorbed in a continuous absorption into infinity, which is a good term for that which is satisfying. And that infinity of all the different levels of the vrittis, even when they're suspended, or kundalini in the middle path, where you're in samadhi, or you're stuck in a terrible ethical dilemma, in a real life situation. All of those are experienced as being, as being essential to the core.
And when we step out of the sort of treadmill that we get trapped into by the chitta vrittis, or likewise through the digital encounters that we have, when we can pause and step out of them and really become embodied, that it is at that very juncture where we can drop into the embodied experience of our sense of what is of value to us, what is of meaning, what is important, our moral ground, our ethical underpinnings, our sense of truth and generosity and kindness, these things that are inherent to all of us, that when we're off in our minds, in our chitta vrittis, or off in some rabbit hole down, investigating something on the internet, where we're so detached from the embodied experience that we run the risk of losing sight of what is really meaningful to us, and of losing sight of connection, even though in many ways chitta vrittis are a way we connect with other people, just as social media is. But they also have this very delicate aspect to them where they can become detached from the embodied sense of truth and meaning and value that we bring to the world. And so once you start noticing signs of stress, signs of flitting from one thing to another, whether it's just in everyday life due to your own chitta vrittis, and not being kind of tuned into yourself, or whether it's online, or in a grocery store just trying to figure out whether you tap your card or stick it in or whatever. Poor old folks like us, it's like you can't even see where to do it. But anyway, that's another story.
It's the story.
It's the story. But then it's like this, the good thing is that things like that slow you down enough that you realize that where we can find discernment is within our bodies, within the signs and signals that our bodies give us. And so talking about the yamas and niyamas, and talking about discernment is a natural sort of segue after thinking about this exoskeleton of chitta vrittis.
Yeah, it's interesting that we've been thinking about just so if you get the idea of yoga, and then say the idea of the Kundalini, which is, it's a great idea. I mean, ooh, I'm going to do that. And so you do your 10,000 bastrikas and your bandhas and mudras as best you can learn them from the internet and all of that. Sometimes that very phenomenon of the vritti is still taken over by that which causes the vritti is ultimately, in the tradition, is the principle of asmita, which means I am. So it's this principle of a survival principle and ultimately the creative principle. It's a beautiful principle unless you identify with it, of I am, and it's creates space and time, and it creates stories that can become extremely problematic. But oftentimes, even, and this is what happens in many different yoga practices, we become attached to the idea, I'm going to be enlightened, I'm going to get out of here, or I'm going to become the clear light, and so I will, and it's usually, most sentences are starting with, I'm going to get that, or I'll become the most humble of all servants of servants. I'll do bhakti. And and this is the natural tendency, more so with the piles and piles of quick information. Mm-hmm. And so so one of the traditional things is, before you go, oh, I am going to awaken inside of me and my central channel, and I'll have in my heart all beings. It's kind of, you have to flip it over, and there's this thing where you recognize not the kundalini inside of you, but you start to recognize outside of you that everything, you're being supported by, this magical thing called the universe, called the shared experience. And this is what, we start with that which we really share, and this is what, all of the real suffering comes from, like, I get mad at the grocery store, when my credit card won't work or something, ultimately because I'm following an idea that I need to do this, I need to do that, but then I'm not dissolving that principle of I. And so there's a famous chant that a lot of you know, where we look at the king of all the nagas. Remember, nagas are divine serpents that slither between thoughts and slither all over the place. And one is to this beautiful naga who's called the king of, who has thousands and thousands of radiant cobra hoodies that actually open to infinity, that represents all of the things beyond, even beyond the internet, the infinite worlds and galaxies and different dharmas, teachings, and then other beings. And then but this whole serpent in the beautiful myth, which is a construction of mine, exists and loves to hold everybody else up. And so actually your yoga mat, and it's used to bless the yoga mat in the yoga tradition, that I recognize my yoga mat as being the king of nagas who support the great mandala of the universe that we all share. And so you get in and you start to see that everything is supporting, and supporting, you start to get a sense of how the body works, how all of the chitta vrittis are really dependent on these deeper transmuted emotions that we call prana, or this vibrant, whatever it is. And that's the way the tradition is actually taught. You get this sense of what counts, and it's usually just like, a little sense of love, for somebody else. And then you can begin the practice, and you've got context.
Yeah, and it's from there that we start to be able to discern, where because you have had the experience of being, in a sense, the I amness, the asmita-ness, that I am, and then you've dissolved. And so in a sense you have this paradoxical vibratory quality going on within your visceral experience, that in a very real way, both of those aspects of things joining together, where the I amness disappears because you have seen the interconnected nature of everything, including yourself. That's where you find the foundation from which to really check in with gut feelings, with intuitive sense of what is truth, what is beauty, what is moral, and what will serve this other part that is at that stage in your realization. It's as much a part of you. This whole infinite universe feels viscerally as strong as this part of I amness. So, it's not like, well, I'm going to be this servant of everyone else and be the doormat and have everybody walk on me for ages and ages, which can happen, but more so that you see through all of that, and there's the ability to really deeply, deeply connect, which is what is often missed in digital things and in yoga.
Yeah, when you get a taste of the connectedness, you actually don't care whether you are enlightened or not, because then you start to see, oh, that might take me a few billion lifetimes, but it's something of a whole quality of and you don't even want to get rid of I amness. You just want to. You see the beauty of it because it isn't actually you, and it's hard to explain, but I think we've all had tastes of this, that all of that ambition, there's a sense of deep satisfaction, and yet I amness is still out there. All of this technology is still out there, natural technology, which is the creation of, the three worlds, they would say, and that's natural technology, but it's all Shakti. It's all divine, and the Shakti exists, and it's actually the method. And Shakti is essentially based in ignorance, or this flipping, where all of a sudden something is reduced, but that Shakti itself is the way to actually perceive, to feel this beauty, this, and so you can't live with it and you can't live without it, and and that's kind of that's the big joke of yoga, and so you're seeing the time and space, which are totally dependent on this principle of getting name and form confused. It's natural. That is also and it unfolds and it reveals, just like we said, a tree reveals what the sky is like, or flowers unfolding in the sky. Then you get a sense of sky, but without that, it's pretty boring. And yet a lot of people, they think, oh, trees and flowers, they're just, these chitta vritti things, they're temporary. And anything temporary is boring, and I don't want anything to do with it. And this is the kind of the common and the kind of the beginner's big mistake in all of these different, and we're currently culturally, we had that same mistake it's being reflected in the use of information technology.
Yeah. And so we wanted to kind of pull it together a little bit by, like, then if you can see these parallels between sort of what is going on technologically in the world and what the human condition is, with chitta-vrittis arising and discernment dropping away and discriminating awareness, which is, as we know, sort of this vital part of the yoga practice. Discriminating awareness being truncated because we've become disconnected from the embodied experience of truth, of the depth of the feeling of connectedness and love and generosity. So the same sort of thing happens and is quite vivid these days in the digital age, where there has been this huge disconnect, where there's this frantic, I need this many likes, I need this many followers, I need, where something that is this incredible tool to facilitate interconnectedness, to facilitate this connection way beyond ourselves, turns into something that, rather than promoting some of the wonderful aspects of human existence, like generosity, start promoting some of the more complex and unfortunate things like jealousy. And that is, sort of this symbolism, this symbolic parallel to what we were talking about with the chitta-vrittis and people, becoming sort of caught in their own identity. And so as we look at this age that we're in, and we realize this isn't going away, and we don't want it to go away, but what we want to be able to do, as we want to do in our own lives, is pause long enough to say, well, what steps can we take? What steps can we take to serve the situation at hand in the most sort of beneficial way? What will benefit this situation as a whole? And starting small or starting big. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just trying to think of something good that's come from all of this.
Oh.
Besides all of you, of course. And, because you can go from the one extreme in which a lie, or a complete misrepresentation of other people, of one's own government, of one, all that these can actually cause quickly, huge human rights abuse, war. But what that is up against, and the same thing we're up against culturally, is so many people, because of their access, which they have most of the time to the internet, unless
they're living in Myanmar at the moment.
Unless it gets cut. They have access to all of this information, and they're actually finally able to inquire and study history. Okay, and history, of course, relates to, as you know, histos, the flesh. And so, not that the theories of history, you can have so many of them, they change, but the actual facts on the ground, things actually, like in geology, they actually have occurred, and they're a shared experience. And you can actually go back and study deeper and deeper and deeper what actually happened back in the 1930s, or in 1840, or in 16,
Oh, wow.
16, what actually happened? And people are doing that in all of their own societies and cultures, which in all of that's available, and it's kind of like, and then they can communicate, and then they, just like here, then you start to say, well, God, we're all in the same situation, just different weird variations of the same joy and then the same potential suffering. And that connection is unique historically.
Oh, it's profound.
It's exciting.
Yeah. And it can flip so quickly into fear or mistrust, and yet it can flip back from fear to one of trust. And so as individuals, what our individual responsibility in a sense is to notice when we are interfacing with the internet or with our own chitta-vrittis and we are upregulated or stressed out or depressed, and decide what are we, how are we contributing to that, and how can we not contribute to that? How can we, instead of going off on tangents like fear that might propel us, that might be, for instance, when you were talking, I was just thinking of like when some of these movements all over the world have happened, and people, suddenly the people are able to have their voice heard, and the government comes in and closes them down. How do we face these situations without becoming angry but not becoming dominated? And part of the responsibility really, really is to be as vigilant with oneself about being truthful in the way we interface. Whether or not everyone else is, it doesn't really matter. In terms of our own actions, the only actions we really can determine are our own actions, so that if we're acting in alignment with what we know to be kind and generous and loving and truthful, then that seed is put out there. And even if we are in a situation like many where the government might come in and do something to try to stop us, we then still, rather than rejecting everything and becoming
Well, if you respond,
soured by it.
if you respond in anger, not that anger might arise, but you have to
Be skillful.
Be skillful and use discriminating awareness, or to see that, your own demons, and that way you could practice, it's not like, well, compassion is perhaps, but you can dovetail your own anger and become clear and just, and continue to attempt communication and interfacing.
And truth.
Yeah, and truth, yeah.
Yeah.
Otherwise, which happens much of the time, I just become so angry, and we've got to get rid of those people, and maybe if we kill them all, then we can have nirvana on earth, rather than communicate.
Yeah.
Communication is difficult. Oh.
But it's, what we're really hoping with this little evening chat is that we might really, encourage all of us to be careful and to be also proactive, to be in tune with what is in your visceral embodied experience. This sense of individuality, individuality and interconnectedness at the same time. How do we perpetuate that communication that allows that to expand beyond beyond our own little world into the world of, others. And in a way, excuse me, in a way it's like when we meditate and you have this experience of seeing this calmness that is existing, and at the same time all the chittavrittis coming up and being there, and being able to be with that, rather than seeing it as dissonance, seeing it as a pattern, and then being able to engage, in part because you see more depth by being able to have equanimity in that place where the pattern is arising. And that's really where the discriminating awareness comes in, is in that state where you become steady and stable in chaos, which, you go in and out of, if you might have noticed.
A few times.
A few times every 45 seconds sometimes.
Yeah.
So, so a practice, you want to do that chant for the Mani Bharata
Oh, we could.
to end it? And,
Yeah.
but we really recommend that you give yourself the space to feel the overflow from your sitting practice, from your asana practice into your everyday life, and to notice when you become upregulated or downregulated. And when that happens, to just take a pause, and maybe do a little teeny meditation or a little teeny chant, like teeny meaning 1 minute, where you really shift gears, because the more adept you become at going from your practices into engaging in the world, the more it starts to be just a natural impact that what you are doing in the world really is your practice. Like Richard always has said, do yoga all day, every day, all night, every night. And people laugh at that and think, ha ha ha, he doesn't really mean it. But you do, because you mean that when it happens naturally.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Good. Should we do that chant?
Sure.
Money? That one?
And I'll
Okay.
stick with
Okay. This is from the Kurma Purana, where Kurma means a turtle, so it's the Turtle Purana, if you want to look it up. Om Mani Bratpana Sahasra Vishvam Bharamandalaya Anantaya Nagarajaya Namaha Om. Thank you.
So we hope this gave you something to think about, something to practice with, something to not think about. And we will stick around for questions. We'll stop recording, but stay for questions if anyone has any, and we'll be doing another talk in a month.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We'll probably talk between now and then too.
A little bit.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Good to see you.